So keep on going with your silly dream by Piter on AO3. This fic may conclude suicidal thoughts. That is your warning. Chapter 4. Makeover! Finally. Read by Lily 6645. Izuku felt his eye twitch. He was exhausted. Only the threat of bodily harm kept him awake. It's been 2 months and 6 days since his encounter with Eraserhead. The Eraserhead. He wasn't a popular hero. He was underground. That was kind of the point. Not that it mattered to Izuku. After all, he remembered how he was treated by the most popular hero. He'd formed a routine of sorts by now. Get up, say bye to Mom after eating, suffer through school. That was nothing new. After, though, he'd do his homework, maybe relax a little, before getting ready and going on one of his walks. He'd patch himself up after he got home. Around him, Izuku wondered if his classmates noticed. He had been quieter, spacier, and he himself was well aware of it. And yet, he almost welcomed it, the fogginess, like he wasn't fully there. He shook his head, refocusing on his paper. There was another issue. Aside from the new aches, bruises, and lack of sleep, the police. They meant it when they said that they'd crack down on vigilantes. If not for his small frame and plain appearance, he'd definitely be caught already. Thankfully, they didn't take him seriously enough to put an actual hero or detective on his trail. That he knew of, that is. As he garnered more attention from law enforcement, he needed a better disguise. He glanced down at his list he'd roughly decided on. For one, actual goggles instead of his cracked sunglasses, and something to cover his lower half of his face. He'd also scrawled out new gloves, some knee pads, and some weights for at-home conditioning. Being a semi-unofficial vigilante was hard work, and Izuku was still far too weak. After a thought of stained, splintered thing, he decided to add a new baseball bat to his list. He'd shuffled around the costume store. This would be the hardest part. He'd been to find goggles for someone with normal sight and vision. That may have sounded simple, but, well, in a world where only 20% of people were quirkless, it was harder than it sounded. The quirkless were disregarded. Most couldn't even find a regular job, let alone good goggles that weren't supposed to enhance one thing or another. So instead of actual goggles, Izuku went to the costume shop, Party City. It was his best chance. After hours of frustration and regular clothing and accessory stores, he browsed, digging through the 5 and below bin, which slightly more force than was needed. He'd been looking for ever. Was a pair of goggles really too much to... He yanked out a pair of goggles on cue, with black frames and red-tinted lenses. It was merch from some hero he'd never heard of. It was perfect. Izuku proudly sat them at the register alongside his $5. He received a weird look for his enthusiasm, but he couldn't bring himself to simmer down. Izuku took a breath before stretching. It became part of his routine, added in after an effort to minimize his soreness. Of course, it didn't work, since he was regularly getting his shit beaten out of him. both at school and during his nighttime activities, but it helped, kinda. He slipped on the dark red hoodie, littered with black patches where he'd stitched rips. He wore black cargo pants rather than sweats, with knee pads he'd sewn on earlier. With his trusty knife and new baseball bat, he moved into the most essential part of his outfit. He slipped the goggles on. They were a surprising quality for only $5. As while the lenses appeared red, they didn't hinder his vision. He tied a black bandana around the lower half of his face, putting a pin in the knot to better keep it in place. He methodically pinned back his hair, then again pinned the hoodie so it covered his hair completely. Honestly, Izuku had a pretty plain face. There wasn't really a need for so much protection. But hey, maybe Izuku was milking it just a little. He almost felt like a hero, getting ready for action. He almost felt worth something. He stared at himself in the mirror. His mom would freak if she ever found out. But what if she didn't? Izuku licked his lips, tongue accidentally brushing against the fabric of the bandana. What if he just left Deku behind? Left the bullies, left all the adults who had failed him. What if he just disappeared one day? And that's it for Chapter 8, Makeover, finally, of So Keep On Going With Your Silly Dream by Piter on AO3. On to the next chapter. The Eraserhead Interlude 1. Aizawa glared down at the file in front of him as if it had personally offended him, which technically it had. Why? Because the vigilante was a damn pest. Aizawa could never get a word out of them, and somehow they were always lucky enough to avoid the police's capture. He wasn't one to mind vigilantes normally. This one, however, was forcing him to not only do extra work, but collab with the police. If it was only Takashi, he wouldn't mind. But some of the other officers were actually nuisances. He scrubbed a hand down his face. Are they seriously that big of a threat that you have me working on it? It's not rational. You know this. Takashi gave an apologetic smile, rubbing the back of his neck. We have to take vigilantes out before they become a big deal. You remember the last time we gave a vigilante some slack. Yeah, he grumbled. I know. This guy'll be out of our hair soon. Glad to hear it. The detective pinched the bridge of his nose. Higher-ups have been on my ass about it. Eraserhead crouched on the ledge of a rooftop irritably. He could be looking into hundreds of other real threats, but no, there he was looking for some punk vigilante who's taken more ass whoopings than he'd dealt. Hell, the guy had only been active for around 3 months. Aizawa was what you would call very overqualified and was sick of this shit. He crept along rooftops, light on his feet. While he knew the vigilante picked up quickly any sign of Aizawa, and they immediately booked it. It was frustrating. Aizawa jumped at the deafening boom that echoed through the empty streets. He looked up and, sure enough, a plume of smoke was drifting through the air. It was just a couple streets over, so he quickly took off. Whether the vigilante was or wasn't there, he was a hero. The problem was immediately evident. A large man, and Aizawa did mean large, as in 14 feet tall and just as wide, roared in the center of the road. A gas station next to him was in flames. He held a limp worker in his hands. So strength and size was evidently part of his quirk. Hopefully that was it. Fatty roared again. This time, flames spewed out of his mouth. The hostage screamed and resumed struggling. At least he knew they weren't dead now. He braced himself, preparing to sprint into action. Then the giant staggered back, hopping and holding his foot, shaking the ground as he did so. The worker was tossed to the side, and it seemed their instincts won over pain. They sprinted the other way. He'd need to track them down later. He returned his attention to the villain. At the ground was a small individual, baseball bat poised and ready to strike. He could see the glint of something silver and black stuck into Fatty's foot. It looked like Aizawa was in luck after all. That was the end of Chapter 9, the Eraserhead Interlude 1 of So Keep On Going With Your Silly Dream by Piter on AO3. Thank you for listening.